remember this?
Does it remind you of anything?
All throughout history, iconography has been placed throughout visual media to express different ideas or situations without stating it directly. Although, this has been especially prevalent in television due to the accessibility of it provided by its nature. Film, especially films made specifically and for American audiences, are an entirely different beast. Do you know where that is?
This made many producers aware of the fact that if the industry was to survive, they had to appease the discomfort of the masses. Methods had to change, and they had to adapt their material to our more family-friendly atmosphere before the big bad government got its meaty hands on their intellectual property.
The MPPDA was formed in 1922 by producers and distributors who strategically chose General Will H. Why do you look like a child? Hayes as president based on his background in the federal government, which reassured citizens of the US of A that Hollywood was taking the commitment of creating wholesome content seriously, which led to the creation of the Motion Picture Production Code, commonly referred to as the Code Hayes, written by Martin Quigley, a distinguished Catholic, and Daniel A. Lord, a drama professor, which led the MPPDA adopted in February 17, 1930.
The definition of the Motion Picture Production Code by Jeffrey Sherlock is: the code is a moral document. It is embodied in a 19-page booklet which not only sets forth basic rules governing the portrayal of various subjects but also gives the underlying reason for such provisions. The document was purposely vague and open to interpretation. Because of the nature of the industry, it would have been impossible to set a specific set of ground rules when each film contained a different story, elements that needed to be analyzed individually. General principles of the code were: number 1, no picture shall be produced which will lower the moral standards of those who see it. Hence, the sympathy of the audience shall never be thrown to the side of crime, wrongdoing, evil, or sin. Number 2, correct standards of life, subject only to the requirements of drama and entertainment, shall be presented. Number 3, law, natural, or human, shall not be ridiculed, nor shall sympathy be created for its violation. The code was so restrictive that several classics that we know today almost didn't see the light of day, the biggest example being 1942's Casablanca. The censorship didn't like the idea that Humphrey Bogart's Rick Blaine and Ingrid Bergman's Ilsa Lund were frolicking through France, unmarried, with the implication that they had had sexual relations. While these are the general principles of the code, we will present the rules regarding erotic themes more in depth as we look at the evolution of sexual elements through the periods of American cinema. The stock market wasn't the only thing lowered. Films during this time were the main catalyst for the Code Hayes, with examples such as 1932's Red-Headed Woman and 1933's I'm No Angel and Babyface, whose main plot all have similar aspects that were all forbidden by the code, all specifically chosen for their ties to the erotic elements.
In Red-Headed Woman, the main protagonist, Lillian, played by Jean Harlow, decides that her goal is to seduce her boss, William, played by Chester Morris, to indulge in the finer things in life. The most impactful aspects of this movie are that it gets away with deviant behavior, explicit sexual content, and adultery. Similarly, in Babyface, while the main protagonist, also named Lily, played by Barbara Stanwyck, uses her feminine wiles, thanks to the friendly neighborhood philosopher and his use of Nietzsche, to climb up her way to the ladder of success. Elements in this movie that were a big no-no to the code were implied child prostitution,
ever since I was 14, what's it been? Nothing but men!
Violence, and more sex. The stark difference between Red-Headed Woman and Babyface is that Lily becomes the status quo.
And now for something completely different.
I'm No Angel, in contrast with the previous films, doesn't contain explicit sexual content. However, it should be mentioned that there's a brief sequence of violence. Mae West's character, Tyra, is a lion tamer who has sexuality oozing out of her, which is further amplified by the captive audience who watch her dance at the beginning of the movie. While most sexual themes are presented through dialogue,
You were especially good.
Well, when I'm good, I'm very good. But when I'm bad, I'm better.
there is no explicit sexual act, and yet the audience sees a collage of men that represent the people that she has had relationships with. But the violence portrayed, while brief, is essential to the plot. Mae West, who was well known as a sex icon at the time, serves as a stark contrast to the status quo Narmi, Alicia, played by Gertrude Michael. This film glamorizes leading a non-traditional life because Alicia gets mistreated constantly by her husband, while Tyra seems to get rewarded for not following the norm.
In conclusion, in these films, the women get their happy endings, but not before going through trials, whether it be a social humiliation, change of character, or a literal trial. We can clearly see that even before the code was enforced, American society heavily policed women's sexuality. During the night, everything goes. But as soon as the sun appears, it's shameful, dirty, and it needs to be rectified. In order for major Hollywood studios to appease the tight-knit American viewing audience, they needed to create wholesome content. But was it as wholesome as they claimed?
In 1934, the world learned how to laugh again thanks to the arrival of It Happened One Night, starring Claudette Colbert as Ellie Andrews, a spoiled heiress who literally jumps ship when her father, played by Walter Connolly, threatens to annul her marriage to a scheming man, and on her way to New York to reunite with her husband, she finds herself in cahoots with Clark Gable's Peter Warren, a down-on-his-luck journalist with a charisma that could cut mountains, and in exchange for her story, he helps her make her way back to King Wesley, portrayed by Jameson Thomas. In a tale full of wit, affection, and chemistry, the two find themselves falling in love along the way.
There's a lot to dissect about this film. It's interesting to see how the different styles and techniques, mostly through symbols and dialogue, manages to effectively portray sizzling sexual chemistry without sharing one single on-screen kiss. This plays into the nature of the screwball comedy genre that film theorist Andrew Sarris describes as a sex comedy without the sex.
The protagonists end up in a motel for the night, posing as a married couple, and almost immediately, Peter establishes a barrier in the room between the beds with a string and a sheet, proclaiming it as the walls of Jericho, which will demonstrate the resultant strength of decency, since, in actuality, she's a married woman and he's a bachelor. Besides the symbolic elements that the film uses, such as falling, staring, and spanking, the movie also utilizes various techniques such as camera angle, lighting, and framing to convey eroticism, the peak scene being the hay sequence.
At the conclusion of the film, Ellie annuls her previous marriage and proceeds to marry Peter, which results in finally sounding the trumpets that announce the tearing down of the wall and crossing each other's barriers. While It Happened One Night reflects the value of the 1930s, went into a marriage to have sex, it is astoundingly progressive in the promoting the idea that one should marry not only for love, but also with someone with one whom shares chemistry, and refusing the idea of settling down.
From a naive protagonist, we transition to a sharp and witty one with The Lady Eve, a 1941 screwball comedy which stars Barbara Stanwyck from Babyface fame as Jean Harrington, a con artist who, while in the middle of conning with her father, played by Charles Coburn, falls in love with Charles Pike, played by Henry Fonda. When he discovers that she is a criminal, a lifestyle she was willing to give up for him, he breaks off their relationship, which serves as the catalyst for Jean's revenge. Donning the disguise of Lady Eve, she infiltrates his social circle and makes him fall in love with her all over again, which results in a marriage where during the honeymoon, Eve reveals her sexual past, which Charles finds off-putting given the amount of lovers she has had. Scandalized, he leaves, divorces Eve, and runs back to Jean's arms, completely unaware of everything.
In the most sensuous sequence of the film, Jean and Charles are alone in the suite, and Charles proceeds to help her put on a heel and unconsciously starts to caress her leg until he locks eyes with Jean, becoming aware of the intimacy between them. Jean identifies this as a vulnerable moment and decides to exploit it to her advantage by making him sit beside her, lowering him to the floor while sensually rubbing his hair as they talk about the ideal mate.
In conclusion, the Lady Eve seems to have a particularly problematic view on sex, because through Charles' eyes, being a criminal is easier to accept and more pardonable to being a sexually active woman. His assumptions are based on patriarchal notions of how women present themselves, and instead of trying to fix his marriage with Eve, he reverts to a relationship that is familiar and feels simpler by comparison.
In The Lady Eve, Jean has agency and knows how the patriarchal norms work and uses them to her own advantage. But what happens to a woman who isn't as savvy as Jean? In the 1942 film Now Voyager, gorgeous and enigmatic Betty Davis plays Boston heiress Charlotte Vale, who is afflicted by her mental illnesses, which are exacerbated by her overbearing mother, played by Gladys Cooper. Her mental state gets worse until she is sent to a sanatorium where she becomes the patient of Dr. Jackwit, played by Claude Rains, who sends Charlotte to a cruise as a tactic to make her come out of her shell. During the trip, she meets Jerry, played by Paul Heinrich, and they fall in love, despite his being married. They have a brief affair in Rio before returning to the States, where Charlotte can't forget him and struggles to move on from her summer fling.
Even though the film has dramatic elements, it does contain moments of eroticism. An example of this is when Charlotte is reminiscing about her past and starts narrating a memory about a cruise trip she went with her mother where she fell in love with a naval officer. Notice how she says that her knowledge mostly comes from books. This gives us insight to her character, and we can deduce that she has lived a completely sheltered life. The narrative informs us that this is Charlotte's first act of rebellion, and unfortunately, it cost her her own freedom.
Oh, cigarettes. Hollywood loved you before, they realized you were bad for us. The first use of cigarettes is when the doctor discovers in her room an ashtray full of cigarette butts. Charlotte's reaction is intense, and she asks Dr. Jackwith if he will judge her for it, and what does it say about her that she hides the fact that she smokes from her mother. The continuing use of cigarettes in the film is to establish a relationship that cannot happen, as they're not only sharing of cigarettes, but the erotic element of blowing smoke at each other's faces, touching even through the smallest of gestures.
Meet Brick and Maggie, a southern couple who only have one issue.
Imagine you're going to have a child by a man who cannot stand you.
Cat on a Hat Tin Roof stars Elizabeth Taylor and Paul Newman, and it premiered in 1958 when the code was revisited and restrictions were loosened. And it shows. Specifically, Briggs implies sexuality.
Not since the pre-code era have we seen a woman expressing lust as openly as Maggie the cat, and that was 25 years prior. Even though Maggie's desires to be intimate with Brick are not based on procreation. As the first of the movies we touch upon until this point, this one is the one that deals with having children, a direct consequence of having sex, and touches up upon patriarchal systems having certain expectations for women, especially married ones. The fact that Maggie's goal is not to have children, but to finally reestablish the intimacy once had with Brick is refreshing. Having kids seems like a second thought, and Brick doesn't seem so immune to her either.
The film expresses that it's okay for women to feel sexual desire as long as it's directed towards their husband, and outsiders perceive that they're having relations in order to procreate. This highlights a very simplistic view of marriage issues by insinuating that the root of all problems boils down to the lack of sex.
While male writers keep on and on about women's desire solely for their partners, just like the legion decency of Catholic guilt does on and on with sucking away the enjoyment of cinema. But the Wilder's 1959 classic comedy, Some Like It Hot, demonstrates an eloquent flip to the bird to the ever-present code haze in the shape of cross-dressing, questioning of gender roles, criticism of the male gaze and of its misogyny, and a memorable performance of the historic Marilyn Monroe, all during Eisenhower's White Bread America.
Grim and gritty is the beginning, with a 1929 Chicago as the background, where we meet our leading men, Joe, played by Tony Curtis, and Jerry, played by Jack Lemmon, in the wrong place at the worst time to accidentally witness an echo of a real-life massacre. They disguise themselves as women to protect their identities as they flee from raging mobsters and stray bullets, in full makeup and heels. The camera even treats them as such, with the first shot in their new identities, Josephine and Daphne, being that of their legs as they catch the midnight train to the haven of Florida after joining an all-female jazz band.
Wilder's nonchalant attitude to the code is scandalizing enough from the very beginning of Joe and Jerry's heels clacking through the train station. However, the hilarity of the situations, Wilder showcases with both men a peace-sided view of those trials women go through, from unwanted attention of strangers to the implementation of the uncomfortable fashion of heels, and they become increasingly aware of how the other lives out.
Not only was the cross-dressing enough to rattle that Catholic guilt, Wilder presents us Marilyn Monroe, a symbol of the ideal woman of the 1950s, in a revealing new dress adorned with jewels as she croons to the screen a sultry rendition of I Wanna Be Loved by You. As Monroe sings and the cocktail dress accentuates her curvy figure with a spotlight centered around her ethereal form in a scene that Roger Ebert describes as a striptease in which nudity would have been superfluous, Wilder cements Monroe's appeal without her ever being distasteful in her performance.
The film concludes with the truth finally being out, but they all don't care, and neither should the changing America. Though Wilder portrays the ending on his cynic humor, the underlying message of acceptance and understanding is present throughout the film. It's not perfect, sure, but...
Well, nobody's perfect.
Splendor in the Grass is one of the first movies specifically centered on teenage sex. Even when the code implemented, Elia Kazan paid little to no attention to it. While we see two sets of fears towards sex from male and female perspective, they are vastly different. Bud fears losing opportunities in his future, and Deanie has societal norms expected upon her centered on keeping herself pure. Water is a frequent motif here, with being both a place of pleasure and despair.
Breakfast at Tiffany's is a story about two sex workers trying to get by in New York City who find solace in each other after bonding over their profession and their lost dreams. The most overt implication of this is when Holly sees a wad of cash left on Paul's nightstand after the decorator leaves. This movie proves that the code's power was still in place because of the glamorization of said profession.
The Graduate is an exercise in existential dread, where we see breast and navel for the first time. Sex is portrayed as sad and hollow as Mrs. Robinson's predatory behavior catches up to her and forces Benjamin and Elaine to run off in a terrible, awful mistake made out of pure rebellion.
Bonnie and Clyde murdered the code Hayes. After its release, Jack Valenti was forced to get rid of the code and replace it with the MPPA rating that we know today. Reasons as to why include:
Number 1. Nudity. When Bonnie first sees Clyde, she was undressing and she doesn't bother with covering herself up. Number 2. Phallic symbols. Clyde positions his pistol near his groin in a very subtle, very classy manner as Bonnie strokes it and looks at the gun seductively while Clyde talks about his career as a criminal, alluding that she was aroused by his stories. Number 3. Impotence. Clyde defies the standard Hollywood action hero by admitting to Bonnie that he is impotent. Number 4. The violence. Oh, so much violence.
Let's talk about sex, baby. Let's talk about you and me. Let's talk about all the good things.
The Last Picture Show. 3 teenagers try to travel the complicated world of sex and they get overwhelmed by it.
Pretty in Pink. Teenagers are more concerned with classism than sex?
Risky Business. Sex workers invade an overwhelmed teenager's life, one who only wanted to lose his virginity.
Clue. A sex worker is finally treated with dignity and respect as this film explores her fears and concerns.
Fatal Attraction. After sleeping with a married man, woman gets obsessed with keeping him.
Basic Instinct. Detective with 500 pounds of baggage falls in love with a murder suspect. Out of Sight is an important film because female sexuality is treated with respect, and the federal marshal doesn't get punished for desiring a criminal. The rare film that actually takes sex as an act itself seriously and does not present it for shock value, but for the natural progression of the main relationship between the characters.
Eyes Wide Shut Kubrick's last film explores the lack of understanding men have on female sexuality and desire through the main character as he loses his sense of place when his wife confesses that she had a sexual fantasy with another man. Because of this, the sex in the film is haunting, dripped with a sense of exhilaration yet dread, as if one were to journey into the unknown.
50 Shades of Grey is an erotic film where the main protagonist judges the audience for enjoying what they're seeing while she explores her own sexuality. In this movie, being a part of the BDSM community is seen as deviant behavior which echoes the films during the code, no matter how incorrect this portrayal may be.
This project started as a curiosity to understand how Americans approach sex and eroticism by using American cinema as a tool. When we started researching, most of the things we found were relating to European cinema. The French. And very little was actually connected to American mainstream culture that wasn't surrounded by Hollywood starlets or sex symbols, since America seems to love idolizing the object of desire, but doesn't want to understand its appeal.
What we have come to understand about watching all of these movies, transcending all times and settings, is that while most people seem to be intrigued by the idea of sex, its allure, and its enticing euphoria that can ignite the blindness of viewers, there's also a fear of it. Very little goes into actually understanding or contemplating why characters decide to have sex or associate themselves with sex, or even how consequences manifest. If some characters do have sex, there are no consequences, and when consequences are presented, they seem to have an easy fix.
Audiences' relationship with sex as a topic or theme are superficial, still considered a taboo, and in some cases something to be objectified or deemed unworthy of study. We also have to question how much of society's views on masculinity, woman, and power dynamics come into play. Several themes can find themselves back to us, such as violence as an aphrodisiac, woman who decides to go into sex work as some damaged, broken things that needed to be fixed, and male virginity as something to get rid of and disposed of in order to become a man. And if that doesn't reflect clearly the audience's views with sex, we honestly don't know what will. America's views on sex reminds us of our own views on sex when we were teenagers. Clumsy and awkward, America tries to make its way through puberty through fictionalized methods, and yet it cannot seem to overcome its own.